I want to bring in NBC's Kelly O'Donnell, who's in Paris. Jim Messina is surrogate for the Biden campaign, served in the Obama White House and ran President Obama's re-election campaign in 2012. Peter Baker is the New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MSNBC political analyst. He is also traveling with the president in France. Okay, Peter, you wrote that this trip is going to put Biden in an unfamiliar position, finding both solidarity and isolation on the world stage. Typically, these kinds of trips let him find his comfort zone, in addition to providing a break from Washington. But how is this trip different?
Yeah, of course, President Biden is an internationalist. He has spent a lot of his presidency trying to rebuild the alliances that frayed under his predecessor, former President Donald Trump, who didn't get along very well with the NATO allies here in Europe or other allies around the world. But this is Biden's first trip here since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel and since the war in Gaza has inflamed so much of the world. And unlike President Biden, a lot of European leaders are very down on Israel, very much in the pro-Palestinian camp. A number of European countries, including Norway, Ireland, and Spain, recently decided they would recognize an independent Palestinian state. International bodies have called for arrest warrants on Prime Minister Netanyahu with the support of European leaders. And so he's both rallying the world on Ukraine while he's here, but defying the world, at least the Europeans, when it comes to the Gaza war.
So, Kelly, what's the president's message to our allies, and how do we expect him to try to use the message to build support among voters back home?
Well, certainly for the president, one of the things that we hear from him frequently now, both in his public addresses on the campaign trail from the White House and in finance meetings, those fundraisers, is talking about how he hears frequently from world leaders, especially those in Europe, about the essential nature of the United States on the world stage. So he wants to tap into that as a force for good and to try to bring together these leaders. And he has done that in terms of the Ukraine solidarity that we see with Europe, and to make the distinction that the war in Israel and Gaza has been about an attack on Israel and the U.S. Commitment to support and defend Israel. And at the same time, it is a different set of circumstances with Russia invading Ukraine. So this is a difficult needle to thread. And we've seen the president be more critical of Israeli leadership in recent days. So trying to then do these important, difficult, complex, urgent problems against the backdrop of the history that brings him to Europe, which is, of course, the 80th anniversary of the Normandy invasion, and a reminder of how democracy is fragile, it has to be defended, and it can, in fact, be challenged to a point of real fear among our core allies. He talks often about concerns expressed to him about a return of Donald Trump to office, and that is the kind of thing he will try to argue and play out going forward.
Yeah, I mean, just those images, Peter, as you well know, they can often be powerful, right? D-Day resonates with so many Americans, obviously, older Americans, maybe in particular, who are very dependable voters. Is there something or some things that the White House would like to come back to the United States having achieved besides those images?
Well, images are important. And in fact, the president is going to go not only to Normandy tomorrow with the other world leaders, he's going to go back to Normandy a second time on Friday. He's going to give a speech at Pointe du Hoc. He's going to give a speech basically that mirrors what Ronald Reagan did famously in 1984, where he praised the heroes who climbed the walls of the cliffs to take on the Nazis. And he's going to, in effect, wrap himself in that patriotic image, the same way Ronald Reagan did, a generation ago. But most importantly, I think he's also sending a message to Americans back home about why this matters. Yes, they may be tired of overseas commitments. They may not be fully supportive of sending lots of American money and weapons to Ukraine. But he's going to make the case, as Kelly said, that this is, there's a through line from World War II to today. He's going to meet with President Zelensky of Ukraine while he's here in France and try to make the argument to Americans that it matters to them, matters to the United States, what happens in the battlefields of Ukraine.
Can you think, Jim, a Reagan-esque speech, which is grounded in patriotism, work, though, in 2024?
I really do, and I think it's the perfect contrast. I mean, Chris, you started out by talking about this. This is Joe Biden's sweet spot. This is where he feels comfortable. And as voters start to focus on this election, the contrast between his steady leadership, which is what he promised, and Donald Trump's sense of chaos and anarchy, and his past comments praising dictatorial leaders, talking about how great they are, really controversial statements about democracy, saying he would want to be a third term, and, this might be the last Democratic election. He'll be a dictator. That contrast is exactly what the Biden campaign is hoping for. And so I think Friday's speech really sets the tone, as he did before the 2022 elections. People kind of criticized the Democratic speech then, but it turned out to be a masterstroke. And I think the White House is trying to replicate that on this hollowed stage of France on Friday.
There are beautiful words, there are great speeches, and then there are the realities, right, that voters feel they're living through. And there was a quote from Ian Bremmer, who, as you know, is the head of the Eurasia Group, and he told Politico this: if this election is all about foreign policy, Biden's going to lose. And obviously cited in particular the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, which have become very wearying to a lot of voters. So how does he deal with that reality, wars that have not gone as well and have gone on longer than most American voters probably would have liked?
Well, look, typically Americans reward leaders in times of war and crisis, and they understand they want a strong leader, and that's what Joe Biden is proving to them. Now, that said, he can do both things. He needs to talk about the economy. He's doing that every day. That's his ads in the battleground states. Those are his appearances that you're covering and everyone's covering. So he is talking about the issues of the day, but campaigns are also won on contrasts. And when I ran President Obama's campaign, I said to him all the time, if this is a choice, the incumbent usually wins. If it's a referendum, he usually loses. So Biden has to drive this choice. And I think that's what Friday is about. And that's what all of his appearances in the battleground state are about.
It is maybe a contrast part of the problem. And I'm not talking about potentially foreign policy. Our chief political analyst, Chuck Todd, wrote about the voters still on the fence. This just published. And he wrote, if both candidates are viewed more negatively than positively, then the undecided voter is likely to judge them in a very transactional way. That is, which candidate will be either better for me or do the least damage. And his argument is a lot of that centers around economic issues as well, for which the Biden administration, for all the statistics that supporters will throw at you, we know that there are a lot of swing voters out there who have said, I don't know, I think I felt better under Trump. His numbers are better now than they were actually, I'm talking about Donald Trump, at the end of his presidency. So there's a little bit of sunning up of that. But do you buy that? Do you buy that ultimately, while these other things will be important on the fringes, ultimately, it's the economy, stupid?
Well, look, what I think is true is that, you have the statistic that really keeps me up at night, the fact that Donald Trump's approval rating has gone up since he left office. People forgot about some of that chaos. I think that's what we have to remind them. And I think that is one of the keys to this campaign, to get people to remember the chaos and why they got rid of this guy in the first place. Now, do I think that the Biden campaign's got to lay out a very clear narrative on the future? Yes. And I think you'll see that in the debates. You'll see that in his convention speech. But it's also reminding people of why they fired Donald Trump in the first place. And those are with the core swing voters that you were talking about, Chris.
So while covering the White House is always an historic privilege, sometimes it's better than others. So to Kelly O'Donnell and Peter Baker in Paris, a little bit of envy for those days when I was covering the White House. Thank you both. And of course, Jim Messina, thank you.